there's a puckish side of me which says join the California Academy of Sciences too. They both would seem to be good investments, don't you think, Don? In case you didn't guess from that shameless and straightforward remark, I'm Greg Farrington. I have the pleasure of being the executive director of this magnificent institution, and it's wonderful to welcome you here. If the Leakey Foundation has been such a pioneering funder of some of the most brilliant researchers in the field of human anthropology, the California Academy of Sciences is about two questions that are directly related to the mission of the Leakey Foundation. The first of which is, how did life happen? And the second of which is, how are we going to find a way to hang around? In other words, how did we get here, and how are we going to find a way to stay? And if you can find two more important questions for the coming decades, I'll be happy to take your submission. I think that those are two of the most important ones that we'll be facing as a worldwide society for some time. Tonight we're pleased to present the second lecture this spring, co-sponsored by both the Leakey Foundation and the California Academy. This spring honoring the 2009 Darwin anniversaries. Darwin was, as they say, the man. The 200th anniversary of his birth, and the 150th anniversary on the origin of the species, which still seems somewhat controversial, in case you hadn't checked the news recently. He upset people, you know, and his ideas continue to upset people. They just happen to have one big problem with them: they're right. And these lectures are focusing on human origins, on Leakey and Darwin, revolutionaries. We're delighted tonight to have a neighbor, you might say, most importantly, a fellow of the California Academy of Sciences. You may not know that, strictly speaking, the Board of Trustees of this institution are approved by 300 fellows, scientific folks from all sorts of organizations, most of them locally, who really are the soul of the Academy. And since I report to the board, that means I have about 350 bosses, of which Sarah Hrdy is one. So, there it is. Dr. Hrdy graduated from Radcliffe and earned her doctorate in anthropology at Harvard. And she's currently professor emerita at UC Davis, not so far away, as you can tell. She was elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And she focuses on primate behavior and parenting, particularly mothering. She's author of the prize-winning book, one of the best books of 1999, Mother Nature, A History of Mothers, Infants, and Natural Selection. Her newest book, Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding, was just published and is getting equally rave reviews. After the lecture, there'll be a book signing in the corridor. We welcome you to stop by that table. Meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Sarah Hrdy.
I'm delighted to be here among the good folk of both the California Academy and the Leakey Foundation. And I also see in the audience some old friends, even some kin folks. But you know, for the most part, you're all strangers, which is why I think it's a very good thing that I am among humans rather than another species of ape, which might be more inclined to maim rather than welcome a conspecific. It was, and this is really what I want to talk about tonight, how humans came to be such hypersocial, such nice apes. And I think Richard Wrangham in the promotional for the Leakey Foundation kind of summed up the question I want to talk about, which is, why are, for example, chimpanzees and humans so different in this respect? It was 1871 when Charles Darwin proposed that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes resembling today's chimpanzees and gorillas, and proposed that our ancestors evolved there as well. And what an inspired hunch that was. No wonder 200 years later, we're still celebrating his birthday. Today, we know that around 15 million years ago, the line leading to the African apes split off from the line leading to Asian apes, to orangutans. Around 5 to 7 million years ago, the line leading to Homo sapiens split off from the line leading to the African apes, which is why today we share about 98% of our DNA sequences in common. Furthermore, there are remarkable cognitive similarities which explain why this specially trained chimpanzee in Japan can remember numerical symbols that flash briefly on a computer screen and test better at doing this than many graduate students. But they are also remarkable differences. When researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig tested 106 chimpanzees of all ages, 32 orangutans, and 105 2.5-year-old human children using a specially designed battery of socio-cognitive problems, they found that in terms of spatial abilities, and object permanence, remembering where something is, in terms of quantitative capacities, are they many or are they few of something, or in terms of understanding causality, if I take a stick and push something, what will happen? Chimpanzees, orangutans, and the 2.5-year-old children actually tested in roughly the same range. Where these creatures differed, where humans really differed from other apes, were in the realm of social cognitive functions. For example, humans tested far better at social learning, being able to monitor someone else doing something and then solve a problem the same way. They were also better at communication in that they would follow a point better or follow a gaze better than did chimpanzees or orangutans. And they also were much better at attributing mental states to others, what psychologists call theory of mind. In addition, humans are far more eager to share than other apes are, and they do so even from a very early age. They do so spontaneously and voluntarily. They're eager to do it. Now, other apes, chimpanzees and bonobos, for example, do also sometimes help one another. They do occasionally share food. But what they are doing more nearly resembles tolerated scrounging than the spontaneous generosity of humans and the very considered gift giving, picking out the very best thing to give to someone else. Humans are not only more inclined to share with others, they are also more interested in the mental states and intentions of others. And such other regarding impulses are what provide us with the building blocks for cooperation. Intention reading equips humans to coordinate with others to achieve some common goal, like these Kayapo tribesmen who are beating this timbo plant. They've waded in waist deep into a river, and the plant is then releasing poison that stuns the fish, and women and children come along with baskets to scoop these up. So why should humans differ so much from other apes in these respects? What were the initial origins of these differences? What pushed us here? Now, like most social scientists, I initially assumed that such gifts arrived as neural correlates of our big brain. Homo sapiens has a brain 3 times the size of that of a chimpanzee or of the Australopithecines that Zerai Alemisagad here at the California Academy studies. And it was assumed that being able to communicate using language is what permitted humans to be so much better at intention reading and coordinating behavior. However, following Frans de Waal, Peter Hobson, and others, I'm now convinced that logically, the quest for intersubjective engagement had to come first. Before language, there had to be something else, more basic in a way, and more primitive, Hobson tells us, and with unequaled power in its formative potential that propelled us into language, something that could evolve in tiny steps. That something else was social engagement with each other. Even apart from language, humans differ from other apes in their perpetual questing for intersubjective engagement. Yet the recent discovery by neuroscientists that even comparatively small-brained monkeys, like macaques, possess mirror neurons, and also new evidence for the imitative capacities in newborn chimpanzees make it unlikely that sapient brains alone are going to explain our prosocial inclinations. Back in 1977, Andy Meltzoff showed that right from birth, little humans are interested in imitating others, if you get them in the right mood, scanning their facial expressions, copying them. When they stick their tongue out, the baby sticks the tongue out back. Later on, in 2002, Meltzoff proposed that, quote, the neurocognitive machinery of imitation lies at the origin of empathy and of developing a theory of mind. But when he wrote that, Meltzoff, like most of us, still assumed that humans were the only newborn primates who were going to imitate funny faces that way. Okay. So now, thanks to researchers in the emerging field of comparative infant development, researchers like Kim Bard and Miyawa Yamakoshi in Japan, we know that newborn chimps as well will scan people in front of them and imitate facial expressions. In other words, the basic wiring for that kind of imitation is there. Something else has to be involved to produce the differences that we're seeing between humans and other apes. Over the course of their development, human babies become more and more interested in, more and more adept at understanding what others are thinking and feeling. By contrast, chimpanzee youngsters, after their initial enthusiasm, lose interest by about 12 weeks. So how did these differences between humans and other apes get underway? What accounts for the initial origins of human prosociality. So far, efforts to explain why humans became so inordinately prosocial have focused on either the mind-reading mums hypothesis or the beat out your neighbors hypothesis that I'll talk about in a second. According to the mind-reading mums hypothesis, mothers need to be able to anticipate the wants and capacities of offspring in order to care for and instruct them, because an empathic awareness of the infant's point of view, both physical and psychological, enhances teaching. Consider the case of nutcracking. Wherever tree nuts are available, in those seasons when they're there, people and chimpanzees alike rely on them, gaining thousands of calories by cracking them open. But it takes years to learn how to crack these incredibly hard-shelled mongongo nuts that this Kalahari Bushman woman is opening. And like the children here, their chimpanzee counterparts are also watching their chimp mother crack open kula nuts. Surely a chimp mother and her offspring would benefit just as much as their human counterparts do from being able to learn more efficiently from social learning and from teaching, when such a valuable subsistence skill is at issue. Yet, you know, there have only been 2 instances observed of teaching among these West African chimpanzees. So why haven't chimpanzees been selected for the aptitudes that make teaching and learning so much more efficient in the human case? Far and away, the most often cited explanation for the emergence of our prosocial natures invokes the need for highly competitive social creatures to forge useful alliances and bond with group members so as to beat out other groups, even eliminate them, as you heard in the clip before this lecture began. Darwin himself attributed our species' unusually prosocial impulses to the need for people in one group to defeat other groups, noting that a tribe including many members who were always ready to give aid to each other and to sacrifice themselves for the common good would be victorious over most other tribes. Essays like this one in Nature stress that altruism's midwife must have been conflict between groups. The idea that generosity and solidarity towards one's own group may have emerged only in combination with hostility towards outsiders has really become the explanation of choice for humankind's peculiarly prosocial natures. The same year as this essay in Nature, another one very similar appeared in Science. The New Scientist in 2008 announced a, quote, consensus among anthropologists, archaeologists, primatologists, psychologists, and political scientists that not only is war as ancient as humankind, but it played an integral role in our evolution. Now, I think these authors are correct that competition between groups enhances in-group solidarity. This is something that social psychologists and economists have reported in many different contexts. I think that's right. However, I am not convinced that conflict between groups is going to help us explain these initial differences between humans and chimpanzees in respect to mutual tolerance and cooperative potential, or explain the initial emergence of hypersocial tendencies in this one line of 8. Proponents of the interdemic conflict hypothesis take for granted
that our ancestors spent the last 5 million years engaged in lethal between-group competition. Actually, you just heard that in the clip we began with. It is widely assumed. And they compare the murderous mutual loathing between tribes to the, quote, genocidal urges of chimpanzees. Well, maybe that's what they were doing. But if humans and chimpanzees shared a common legacy of intergroup warfare, and if enhanced social learning and increasingly sophisticated capacities to attribute intentions to others could evolve simply from passing through a crucible of genocide and selective group extinctions, and if, as we have recently learned, other apes have the requisite underpinnings to imitate, learn from, and empathize with others, why didn't the arguably even more dominance-prone and violence-prone ancestors of chimpanzees spend the last 5 to 7 million years evolving such attributes as well so they could benefit from group cooperation, maybe eliminate us? As we ponder this question, it's worth keeping in mind just how far from verified the underlying assumptions about our continuously warlike Pleistocene past still are. Now, we know from archaeological evidence, like this 4,600-year-old burial from Euler in Germany, that a lot of prehistoric warfare went on. This is not in dispute. These are the bones of an entire family killed by arrows and stone axes. But almost none of the evidence for socially organized aggression between groups dates to the late Pleistocene, and none at all comes from the middle to early Pleistocene, which to my mind is the most relevant time period for the emergence of humankind's pro-social tendencies. Even experts on Paleolithic art who are specifically looking for evidence of violence draw a distinction between rock art coming from the last 10,000 years, this bottom one, which clearly depicts intergroup fighting, what most people would call warfare. But depictions of violence in earlier Paleolithic art, this one above, even when you can find it, is usually confined to individual homicides, or else look up on the top left, what looks like some kind of group-sanctioned execution, this poor pincushion full of spears. And this division is very consistent with what ethnographers tell us about small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, where you do have such group executions, and you do have sexual jealousy and rivalries that do escalate into conspecific killing. These things are well documented and perhaps not surprising, because I don't know of a well-studied species of primate where you don't have violence that escalates into one individual killing another. You have intrasexual selection, what Darwin calls sexual selection. Yes, you have murders. What we don't have good evidence for early on is socially organized aggression between groups, the kind of group selection that would give you this hypersociality that we're interested in explaining. Now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I know that. But all these question marks are grounds for caution. Although there is abundant archaeological and ethnographic evidence for intergroup warfare among complex and more stratified hunter-gatherer societies, and among herders and settled people, there is little such evidence for small, band-level, mobile hunter-gatherers living at low population densities, and there's little archaeological evidence for warfare in the Pleistocene. Nevertheless, we do have this tendency to project evidence from the last 15,000 years of warfare back onto our pre-human ancestors, as you heard in the film clip. And also to place special evidence on the evidence from chimpanzees, which do have this lethal group rating, while dismissing bonobos as some kind of eccentric offshoots, even though, in fact, genetically, they are no more close or no more distant than chimpanzees. So this is worth keeping in mind. And as Sam Bowles, one of the main proponents of the idea that conflict was altruism's midwife, candidly acknowledges us and urges us to consider the computer simulations that he and others use to prove that the rewards of in-group amity derive from out-group enmity are based on, quote, artificial histories of early human evolution. We don't know. These histories assume that people were living in fairly saturated habitats. In fact, though, we are still struggling to determine the actual deep history of these creatures. And such genetic evidence as we do have points to relatively small, widely dispersed populations. So we'll see. I don't know. I certainly agree, though, with geneticists that our ancestors came close to extinction. The line leading to the genus Homo might or might not have made it. But was that because neighboring groups were wiping each other out? Or was it because groups were having trouble replacing themselves, having trouble rearing young that survived? The demographic dilemmas confronting early hominids was very much on my mind in 1999 when I completed Mother Nature, a book that emphasizes how it takes about 13 million calories to rear a human from birth to nutritional independence. New babies would be born long before their mother's previous children were nutritionally self-sufficient. There's no doubt that the mother's mate and the meat provided by male hunters would have been very important. But the vagaries of hunting success means that a Pleistocene father, the one man who was the actual genetic father of an offspring, would not always be a sufficiently reliable provider to meet the needs of children who need to eat fairly frequently. And this led me to propose that humans must have evolved as obligate cooperative breeders, rearing offspring very differently than do chimpanzees. And it was also about this time that new information on comparative social cognition in other apes was emerging, leading me to wonder if maybe the mutual tolerance and the perspective taking so characteristic of humans might have to do with our peculiarly unape-like way of rearing young. Might our prosocial natures have evolved as byproducts of cooperative breeding, by which all I mean is a species with alloparental care and provisioning of offspring. Since Ed Wilson first laid out the ground plan for a unified study of sociobiology, a very robust body of theory has grown up to explain why non-human animals, why in those species group members other than parents, alloparents, sometimes evolve to care for and provision someone else's young. All I have time to do today, though, is just to remind you that such cooperative breeding has evolved many times. It has evolved multiple times in social insects. Cooperative breeding characterizes about 9% of roughly 10,000 species of birds and is estimated to occur in maybe 3% of 5,400 species of mammals. Cooperative breeding is especially well represented among highly social carnivores, like those Indian dholes, eating an axis deer. And pack members will routinely return from hunting with pre-digested meat in their stomachs, which they then cordially regurgitate into the mouths of waiting pups, and they'll sometimes feed the mom as well. These carnivores are highly efficient, voracious predators, yet amazingly, grown animals defer to helpless pups and permit immatures privileged access to carcasses during very prolonged periods of juvenile dependence, while the youngsters are learning to hunt, to gather, to provide for themselves. Because young are buffered from starvation, alloparental provisioning permits long periods of post-weaning, or in the case of birds, post-fledging dependence. In humans, of course, we refer to this developmental phase as childhood. Even though none of the great apes, other than humans, exhibit shared care, allomaternal infant care, in fact, has also evolved many times in the highly social order primates. In more than half of a sample of 104 primate species for which we now have good information on infant care, mothers are tolerant of allomaternal access to babies, allowing others near their babies, allowing others to take and carry their babies, and group members other than the mother take and carry another female's infant, allowing her to save energy and reproduce again sooner. In some 24% of this sample of primates, shared care is accompanied by at least minimal alloparental provisioning. Although often the provisioning doesn't amount to anything more than one mother sometimes allowing another female's infant to suckle her breasts and get milk. Only among humans and in the subfamily Callitrichidae, these tamarins and marmosets, the pictures of tamarins, do we find alloparental care and extensive alloparental provisioning, where alloparents spontaneously and voluntarily deliver preferred food items to youngsters. Among these tamarins, mothers typically give birth to twins whose combined weight is 20% of the mom's own weight, as often as twice a year, a very heavy load. That would be equivalent to somebody my size giving birth to two 30-pound babies in the space of a year. These big babies are carried by the mother's mate, except when returned to her for nursing, and then other group members will catch beetles or frogs, other prey items, to give to the offspring about the time they're weaned, a very vulnerable time in all primates. In some tamarins, 90% of solid food eaten by young is provided by others. Now, 35 million years have elapsed since humans last shared a common ancestor with these tiny-brained little squirrel-like South American monkeys. Yet, tamarins, marmosets, and hunter-gatherers have converged on remarkably similar breeding systems with some surprising parallels. These include reproductive traits like concealed ovulation, or what is really more precisely non-advertised ovulation, by females who mate throughout the cycle and into pregnancy, possibly, I think so anyway, to induce males to be more inclined to caretake. You also find that the availability of alloparental assistance, how many alloparents are on hand, is correlated with increased offspring survival, more rapid reproduction, long periods of post-weaning dependence, and the ability to rapidly colonize new habitats, something critically important, of course, in our own lineage. Conversely, the absence of alloparental support is correlated with failures in maternal commitment. That is, faced with insufficient allomaternal support, tamarins, marmosets, and humans all exhibit what is really a very unprimate-like tendency to abandon their babies. Even though I have been stressing how helpful to one another these creatures are, it's very important to remember that cooperative breeding, that term, does not mean that everybody is always nice to everybody else. Cooperative breeding doesn't mean you're always cooperative. It just means alloparental care plus provisioning in that species. Marmosets and tamarins can be fiercely competitive, particularly breeding females competing for access to resources, and the resources there can include access to babysitters. And you can even have a situation where one female will kill the offspring born to her rival, even when the rival is her own daughter. This is the grandmother from hell. Furthermore, in both marmosets and humans, a mother who finds herself short on social support may terminate investment in her own infant, even harming her infant in the process. Along with humans, this is more something that's in Mother Nature than in the new book, Mothers and Others, but I'll just stress it here. Along with humans, callitrichids are the only primate mothers known to deliberately harm their own infants. And this is the dark side of cooperative breeding. So none of us has a machine to go back in time and observe how our ancestors actually reared their young in the Pleistocene, the period between 1.8 million and 12,000 years ago. All we know is how people still living by hunting and gathering reproduced and how they kept their children alive. And what we have learned is that among foragers, the average interval between births tends to be around 3 to 4 years and tends to be shorter than the interbirth intervals typical of most apes, even though humans are born bigger and take longer to mature. How is this possible? Well, you already know. The answer, of course, is allomaternal provisioning. In other apes, infants, once they're weaned, provision themselves. But human children remain dependent on others for many years, as some of you may have noticed. Another big difference has to do with what happens right after birth. The possessiveness of non-human ape mothers is striking. The great ape mother is her baby's sole source of warmth, locomotion, protection, and nutrition, and her dedication is total, a fact that is unfortunately very well known to poachers who realize that the only way they're going to capture an infant to sell in the market is by first shooting the mother. A mother ape remains in continuous, intimate, skin-to-skin contact with her newborn 100% of the day and the night. Half a year elapses before a mother chimpanzee or orangutan is out of contact even for a moment. And some, like this mother orangutan, is going to continue breastfeeding for up to 7 years. Imagine that. Like many monkeys and prosimians, but in absolutely marked contrast to other apes, human mothers are surprisingly tolerant of postpartum access to their new infants. This doesn't mean they're not anxious, but they do allow others to come close and to take their babies. When this Kung newborn's mother returned to her camp in the Kalahari after going off by herself to give birth, she handed her baby to its grandmother, who massaged the scalp and shaped his skull with her hands, as is the custom. And babies are, quote, passed around from hand to hand. That's from the ethnographer Mel Connor, one of the first people to study child care in detail among hunter-gatherers. As with the Kung, among the Hadza, the baby's likely to be surrounded by relatives and is carried by them, held by others, 85% of the time in the period right after birth. Among the Central African Mbuti, the new mother presents the child to the camp, whereupon she hands the baby to a few of her closest friends and family, not just for them to look at him, but for them to hold the baby close to their bodies. Far away in the Philippines, among Acta foragers, the infant is eagerly passed from person to person until all in attendance have had an opportunity to snuggle, nuzzle, sniff, and admire the newborn. Thereafter, he enjoys constant cuddling, caring, loving, and affectionate genital stimulation. Among these Central African FA, arch baby sharers, perhaps the record holders, babies may be held by from 5 to 24 allo mothers, averaging 14 to different caretakers, held by them 39% of the time right after birth, rising to 60% of the time later on. And according to the main ethnographer, Paula Ivy Henry, FA babies with the most allo mothers at age 1 are the most likely to be alive at age 3. So just who are these allo mothers? In the FA case, they are most likely kin. The male allo mothers are most often fathers, older brothers, and cousins, with uncles and grandfathers surprisingly underrepresented. Female allo mothers are most often older sisters, aunts, or grandmothers. Clearly, the luck of the demographic draw, just who's still alive, good at finding food, not encumbered with young of their own at the moment, not sick at the moment, this is very important. Luckiest of all are children with 2 dedicated parents and an assortment of allo parents, uncles, aunts, older siblings, and if they're really lucky, one of them will have a still vigorous grandmother. For immatures in the genus Homo, occasionally have access to a special class of allo mothers, post-reproductive females undistracted by babies of their own, who are hardworking, experienced, altruistic, and maybe knowledgeable. According to the version of the grandmother hypothesis proposed by Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues in 1998, cessation of menses between 40 and 50 is an ape universal. But whereas other apes are not going to go on living very long after menopause, cessation of menses, Hawkes argues that human females have been selected to go on living for decades after they cease reproducing, precisely so that they can contribute to the offspring of younger kin. Some, like this old Himba woman up in the left-hand corner, may be great-grandmothers. Others, infants, might not have a grandmother, but might have a childless great-aunt. This is a picture from Hawkes and O'Connell showing a childless woman with nieces and nephews moving a rock to get at the starchy tubers buried underneath. And what they showed is that in times of food shortage, children with such older kinswomen are going to be the most likely to survive. Now, nobody knows when longer lifespans and longer childhoods began to characterize the hominin line. I'm very clear in Mothers and Others, we don't know. O'Connell and Hawkes tentatively dates these life history changes at the beginning of the Pleistocene with the emergence of African Homo erectus, also known as Homo ergaster. And in Mothers and Others, I lay out reasons why I consider their chronology the most plausible available, and argue that cooperative breeding must have been going in the hominin line as early as that, but it could be wrong. In our society today, almost all infants born survive. We just consider it a great tragedy if somebody's child dies. Fewer than 2% of children die in childhood. However, rates are much higher in the developing world where people lack access to clean water and medical care, and infant mortality rates in the range of 40 to 60% dying before they grow up are fairly typical for traditional societies as well as for populations of wild primates, and probably this is the range that characterized our Pleistocene ancestors as well. Fortunately, though, for our species, the fact that we're here today, flexibility and mobility were hallmarks of forager families. People moved away from adversity and they could gravitate towards opportunities. Opportunities, not just food and water, but opportunities that included the prospect of giving or receiving allomaternal assistance. Among foragers, it is customary for a man to come and live for a period of years with his wife's family, hunting on their behalf in a period of bride service until after one or more children are born. This means that inexperienced young mothers are likely to have social support when they give birth for the first time, which in all primates is a very, very vulnerable point in their life history. Mothers specifically say that they prefer to live near their own kin, that is, to live matrilocally. My pointer isn't working, but maybe this will. No. Okay, so on the left is a mother living matrilocally, and she has a whole lot of allomaternal care. The interesting thing, though, about this Aka case is how little help the father is giving. See, that's just 2.6% down there, and he is, oh, sorry. This is actually holding and carrying a baby, not feeding a baby. But if you look over to the pie chart on the right, where the couple has moved to live in a patrilocal setting among the father's kin no longer with the mother's kin and all her clan around to help them. Look, all of a sudden, dads are doing a whole lot more. My point is that cooperative breeders, mothers and allo mothers alike, are flexible and resourceful strategists depending on demographic contingencies and, of course, local ecology. There is no one type of forager family. I could show you similar data documenting how maternal grandmothers might strategize to end up living with the daughters who need help the most. And in Mothers and Others, I described studies of another cooperatively breeding primate, marmosets, where care is allocated in a similarly strategic and opportunistic way, even though these little guys have tiny brains. You don't need big brains to deliver care strategically. Over the last decade, more and more evidence supports the hypothesized links between having a lot of allomaternal assistance, child survival, and maternal reproductive success. For those of you who are wondering, well, if alloparental care was as important as all that, how come nobody noticed before? There are several reasons, but one, I think, is that until recently, most detailed studies of child development came from Western populations with very low child mortality. By 2008, as more and more information on this came in and as people became alerted to it, Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace reviewed available evidence for 45 traditional human societies, all of them still characterized by fairly high rates of infant and child mortality. The beneficial impact of alloparents in these cases is very clear. The impact of fathers in this sample varied tremendously from being critically important in some societies. Under some circumstances, a baby without a father doesn't survive, to not having a detectable impact at all in some other societies. The most consistently beneficial impacts came from grandmothers and older siblings. In the decades since Mother Nature was published, the demographic implications of cooperative breeding have become increasingly well documented, so that in this new book, I just took it for granted that that's what our ancestors were doing, and I focused instead on what information from neuroscience, sociobiology, and the emerging field of comparative infant development could tell us about the cognitive and the emotional underpinnings. What were the implications? What do we expect to happen when you take an ape and all of a sudden it's being reared by multiple others? I have time for only a few highlights. Even without taking child survival or evolution into account, psychologists and social workers studying Western populations, that is, populations with low child mortality, have known for a very long time that living in extended families affects both maternal commitment and child development. The presence of maternal grandmothers in the house is correlated with increased maternal sensitivity to infant needs. Such infants are likely to be more secure. They develop cognitively at a faster pace. Having older siblings also improves the development of social skills. Leading cognitive psychologists Ted Ruffman and Joseph Perner to quip that theory of mind is contagious. You catch it from your older sibs and older caretakers. Furthermore, attachment to multiple caretakers can enhance perspective taking, as well as children's ability to integrate different perspectives. Turning now to information from comparative primatology, coordinated caretaking and provisioning of young also has marked cognitive and emotional consequences in other primates. Independent experiments at Harvard by Mark Hauser's team and at the University of Zurich by Judith Burkhardt and Karl von Schaik reveal that cooperatively breeding tamarins and marmosets are far readier to pull a rope that delivers food to a monkey in an adjacent cage. They're more eager to do that than chimpanzees are in a comparable test. These generous, quote, other regarding impulses came into play even if that marmoset in the other cage was not a relative. In the wild as well, tamarins coordinate gnawing with their canines to access hard-to-open food and then jointly share the fruits of their labor. Primatologist Paul Garber counted 52 cooperative acts for every aggressive act he observed. Food sharing and provisioning also spill over into other realms, such as volunteering information. Adult marmosets routinely vocalize to immatures to call their attention to novel food items, and they seem to take into account what will be previously unknown to the youngsters. They have even been observed to intervene to prevent immatures from eating a food item that the adult knows to be toxic. Now, teaching is exceedingly rare in animals, but Judith Burkhardt has argued that the greater inter-individual tolerance, which is typical of cooperative breeders, is conducive to enhanced attention to what others are doing, facilitating social learning. Obviously, it does not make good sense to directly compare the cognition of these distantly related South American monkeys with apes, who are a lot smarter, a lot bigger bodied, a lot bigger brained. But when compared with other non-cooperatively breeding New World monkeys, cooperatively breeding tamarins and marmosets not only breed faster and exhibit more contingent maternal commitment, they also exhibit higher levels of inter-individual tolerance along with more pronounced giving impulses, and these traits seem to be conducive to enhanced social learning. So, just to wind up here, I want you to join me in a thought experiment. Take a primate with the cognitive and manipulative potentials and the rudimentary empathy, the rudimentary theory of mind that we have learned that great apes have, and rear that creature in a novel developmental context where maternal care is contingent and where the infant must depend on care and provisioning from multiple caretakers. The resulting phenotype will be more adept, I propose, at perspective taking, very different from a chimpanzee. Then, subject this novel phenotype to novel selection pressures, such that infants best at monitoring the mental and emotional states of others, best at monitoring and understanding their intentions, best at learning from them, these are going to be the youngsters best cared for and best fed. And so what do you get? There will be directional Darwinian selection favoring just the traits: enhanced mutual tolerance, enhanced social learning, social communication, perspective taking, just the traits that comparisons between humans and other apes by Michael Tomasello and others at the Leipzig group, just the traits they require us to explain. Similar arguments can be made for enhanced other regarding impulses in allomothers at older life stages, but I don't have time today. Oh, this picture. This was it was on my desk the whole time I was reading this book. It's a picture by Abel Ebersfeld. Most anthropologists seeing it would say, oh, look, it's two parents holding their babies. These men are each an alloparent, and you have just this splendid comedy of manners that is so typically human, everybody looking and enjoying what everybody else is thinking of the episode. In conclusion, no one doubts that, like other primates, humans are potentially violent. I really don't want to be misunderstood on this. Nor am I suggesting that competition between groups was not eventually very important for shaping traits like ethnocentrism or indoctrinability that are very much part of human nature today. But what concerns me is that by focusing so exclusively on overt intergroup conflict, we overlook occupations such as child rearing that I believe were at least as important, and in my opinion, even more important, for explaining the initial emergence of the peculiarly pro-social tendencies that evolved in apes belonging to the genus Homo. If, as I propose, apes interested in the mental and emotional states of others co-evolved with more costly, slower maturing offspring and cooperative breeding early in the Pleistocene, this means that long before the evolution of behaviorally modern humans capable of language and symbolic thought within maybe the last 100,000 years, and even before the evolution of big-brained, anatomically modern humans within the last 200,000 years, emotionally modern humans were already questing for intersubjective engagement, perhaps as long ago as the beginning of the Pleistocene. Thank you.